Good morning. Welcome to Gordon State College. We're so happy to have you here today on the 80th anniversary of President Franklin Roosevelt's historic visit to Barnesville. Today we are opening an exhibit in Gillibo Hall that focuses on the electrification of rural America. Some of you may have toured the exhibit earlier today, and hopefully all of you will visit the exhibit today before you leave campus. For the next hour, we will celebrate the event that took place 80 years ago, not very far away from where we're gathered this morning. I'd like to recognize some distinguished guests. First, I would like to recognize the members of the Georgia Electric membership cooperatives across the state. I know we have representatives from multiple co-ops, including the state organization today, and without them, this exhibit would not have made it back to a home in Barnesville on our campus. So if we can raise the lights just a bit so we can see these individuals. Any members of the Georgia Electric membership cooperative across the state, please stand at this time. I would especially like to recognize a co-op that back in 1938 was celebrated by President Roosevelt, today known as Southern Rivers Energy, and in 1938 known as Lamar EMC. The original members of that board can be found in your program, and if you're a member of the Southern Rivers Energy Board, please stand so that we can thank them for the impact they continue to have on our region all these years later. I would also like to recognize a special Gordon graduate who is with us today. I just had the opportunity to meet him. Anthony McCullough, are you here somewhere? Where are you, Anthony? There you are. House lights up once again. Many of you know that the marker on College Drive that commemorates August 11, 1938 is there because of his efforts. While still a student here, Anthony actually worked to have the Georgia Historical Society place a permanent marker here. When his first attempt was not successful, just like a Highlander, he continued and continued and continued, and he moved forward. He did not give up, but he persisted, and we're honored to have him with us today. I'd like to also recognize the local, regional, state, and other elected officials who are with us today. And we, in fact, have representatives from Senator David Perdue and Senator Johnny Isakson's office with us today. If we can have the House lights up again, if you're an elected official or, once again, representing those two offices, please stand. I'm also delighted to have Chris Perkins representing Senator Perdue's office with us. He is a Gordon alumnus, so once again, Chris, thanks for always being a good partner and coming back home to represent us well. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you a Gordon graduate and mayor of Barnesville, my good friend, Mayor Peter Banks. So, Mayor Banks, will you come to us at this time?
Good morning. On behalf of the city of Barnesville, I want to welcome each of you to the 80th anniversary of an important event in Lamar County and all of Middle Georgia. We're pleased that you're here, and I hope you will enjoy the exhibit and the program that our committee has prepared for you. And now it is a distinct honor to present to you a dear friend of mine, a college fraternity brother, a former representative in the State House in Georgia. He's a distinguished senator, and he served on the Appropriations Committee and was later named chairman of that committee. And George has an enviable record of public service to Georgia. And at this time, I want you to help me welcome from Americus, Georgia, the distinguished Senator George Hooks.
Thank you, Brother Banks. He is a fraternity brother of mine in several ways and a close friend. And I know you're lucky and proud to have him as mayor of Barnesville. I have been assigned the distinguished honor to reenact Governor E.D. Rivers. Governor Rivers served 2 2-year terms as governor of Georgia in between Gene Talmadge's 3rd and 4th term. And he was quite an orator. I'm going to paraphrase his introduction of President Roosevelt. It lasted about 15 minutes, and the crowd was standing out there in 100-degree weather. They screamed up at him and said, "Turn him off." So I'm not going to give you, I did read in Dr. Fleshner's account of the occasion that we're celebrating today, and I'll paraphrase some of the things. My fellow Georgians, when this nation was plunged into despair by economic royalists and thieves on Wall Street, when despair and discouragement prevails, there are those who believe there is a divinity in the shape of a distinguished gentleman, as well as individuals lifted up by our Creator to lead this nation in this period of strife and strain. Our nation cried out for one to come and lift us up out of economic depression, one who is endowed with the intellectual boldness of Thomas Jefferson, the courage of Andrew Jackson, and the great faith and heart of Robert E. Lee. At the lowest hour, when we cried out, "Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, uplift the downtrodden, and set the captive free," our nation and our people called forth for a great lover of human rights, our fellow Georgian. I bring to you today our fellow Georgian and our neighbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States of America.
Thank you, sir. My friends, good morning. It is a joy and a pleasure to return to this state of Georgia, my adopted state. Always happy to be here. Eleanor, my dear wife, sends you her love. She cannot be here today. She is on the West Coast inspecting defense factories and other things. Before I mention a few remarks, I must pause and look upon all of you, my adoptive people, and I cannot help but notice so many of you wonderful Georgia ladies in the audience today. I must therefore pose a question. Do any of you cook? Eleanor's main dish are scrambled eggs. And sometimes a man just gets a little bit tired of scrambled eggs for breakfast, scrambled eggs for lunch, and scrambled eggs for dinner. If any of you can cook, please see me in a couple of hours. My car is leaving for Washington this afternoon. Many years ago, a Democratic Yankee, a fairly young man at the time, came to a neighboring county in your state of Georgia, came in search of a pool of warm water by which he could swim his way back to health. And he found it. The place, Warm Springs, was a rather dilapidated summer resort. But his new neighbors extended to him the hand of hospitality, welcomed him to their firesides, and made him feel so much at home that he built himself a house, bought himself a farm, and has been coming back ever since. There was only one discordant note in that first stay at Warm Springs. When the first of the monthly bills came in for the electricity at the cottage, I found that the charge was about 4 times as much as I paid back in Hyde Park, New York. That started my long study of proper utility charges and the subject of getting electricity into farm homes. So, it can be said that a little cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, was the birthplace of the REA. My friends, allow me to digress a moment into memory. In the 1920s, I was driving in a modified Model T Ford, special hand controls, which gave me freedom and mobility. And I must say and confess to you, my brethren, not only do I like to drive, I like to drive fast. I stopped at a little village called Mountville, Georgia, near LaGrange, for something cold to drink. Local people gathered round my car and pointed out one of my tires was getting flat. They graciously offered to repair it. And I asked the question, "Do you have an electrical pump?" They said, no electricity here. They replaced the tire. But then and there, the thought occurred to me, Georgia needed electricity. Over 30 attempts at rural electrification were tried, but no national attempt. President Hoover felt that was the responsibility of individual states. Later, as New York governor, I helped to establish the New York Power Authority, 1931, using the great St. Lawrence River as a source of power. Later, as your president, by May 11th, 1935, I issued Executive Order 7037, and the REA was created. Congress later passed the Norris Ribbon Act of 1936, providing over $400 million to electrify rural homes. I must tell you, in the 1920s, only 10% of Georgia homes had electricity. 10%. Congressional representatives would serve as liaisons between the REA and their districts. The REA also became a government financing agency, providing loans to provide companies or co-ops to build power lines in rural areas. Shortly, over 100,000 miles of cable would be laid, bringing light, bringing hope to those who had not. The REA exists to help make life better. Electricity is a necessity of life and ought to be found in every home and town in the nation. The REA is a symbol of progress, and we are not going to stop. The REA means neighbor helping neighbor. Not only is that the Georgia way of doing things, it's the American way of doing things. My dear friends, thank you so much for coming, and God bless you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I'd like to thank the President for joining us once again today to share with us. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the great-grandson of President Roosevelt, Haven Luke.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks again. I thought that was tremendous. That was really, really great. On behalf of the Roosevelt family, let me extend a thanks, to everyone who came out today. It's an honor for me and my family to be a part of this ceremony. Like my great-grandfather, I've developed a love for the South and Georgia in particular. That's partly because my wife is a native Georgian, and as she has informed me, I don't really have a whole lot of choice in the matter. My wife and I live in Athens. Go Dogs. We lived there for a little over 20 years, and it's been a wonderful town in which to raise our 3 children. I myself was raised and educated in the North, something that my father-in-law, who is a native Georgian, had a very difficult time overlooking when I first began dating his daughter. But in the course of his life, he figured he'd met a few Northerners who he supposed were all right, so he thought he could find a way to tolerate me. But then he found out that not only was I a Yankee, I was a Roosevelt as well. Being a Northerner was one thing, but being a Roosevelt on top of that was almost more than he could take. Fortunately, after 20 years, he has come to accept me, if not as a Southerner, then at least as the father of his grandchildren, emphasis on his grandchildren. My connection to the Roosevelt family is through my mother. My grandfather was John Roosevelt, who was Franklin and Eleanor's youngest son. My mother was Anne Roosevelt, though she goes by Nina, and she was John Roosevelt's oldest daughter. As it happens, my mother was very young when FDR died. She has some vague memories of playing hide and seek in the White House with her older brother, my namesake, Haven Roosevelt, and her cousins, but she really has no memories at all of FDR as a person. She grew up in Hyde Park, in what is called the Stone Cottage. The Stone Cottage sits directly adjacent to the Valkill Cottage, which is where Eleanor retired after, or returned after leaving the White House. So as a consequence, because those two houses were so close together, my mother ended up spending a great deal of time with Eleanor, and as a young woman traveled with Eleanor both in the US and abroad, as Eleanor tirelessly pursued her various interests, both political and humanitarian. So insofar as family lore goes, the sort of intimate stories that get passed on from generation to generation, ours center really more on Eleanor than on Franklin. My brother and sister, as well as our cousins, for us, Eleanor is more of a living, breathing relative. I have, just so many stories that my mom tells me about her time with Eleanor. But for our relationship, or our thoughts about FDR, for us, he's more of a historical figure, just like for everybody else. So I have to confess that I possess no expertise at all when it comes to FDR's presidency or New Deal projects like the rural electrification project we are here commemorating today. So bearing in mind that I'm one of the least qualified people standing up here or any place else to be talking about FDR and the New Deal, I do have a couple of observations. The first, as it's been mentioned and you heard in the speech, it's clear to me that FDR's time in Warm Springs greatly influenced him, not only as a man, but as a leader. I think it's a fascinating aspect of FDR's presidency that a man whose upbringing and background were so remote from the world of the rural South should, in the course of his life, come to have so profound and lasting an impact on and understanding for the difficulties facing rural Southerners. I believe it's not only a testament to FDR as a man, but as a testament to a time when our leadership was less remote from the people they governed. There are many stories of FDR while in Warm Springs, getting in his car, leaving his Secret Service detail behind, which I had the honor of being a Secret Service detail here a moment ago, but actively leaving them behind, and then going off in the countryside to talk to local residents as they went about their daily business. I mean, it's just stories of him pulling up to the side of a field where somebody's plowing, and they come up and they talk to the President of the United States. And there's just, it's almost impossible to imagine a sitting president today doing anything even remotely like that. So, I mean, it's possible that things like that, experiences like that, are just things of the past, like horse-drawn carriages, and we're never going to see them again. But I do wonder if our leadership, especially at the federal level, wouldn't benefit from a little more unscripted contact with the citizens they govern. Another thing I would like to mention is that the project we're here commemorating, along with many other New Deal projects that shaped the economic and social life of 20th century America, is a powerful reminder of the ways in which well-crafted government programs have in the past and can continue in the future to make life better for all Americans. I don't at all mean for this to be a partisan sentiment, because obviously the politics of government programs is highly contentious. On the one hand, you have those who think a government program can and should solve everything, no matter how large or small, while on the other, you have those who think that any government program is by definition a waste of money and an encroachment on liberty. I would hope, though, that as we contemplate the impact of this particular project, we come to realize that when done right, a government program can have a lasting positive influence on the social and economic well-being of the American people. I want to thank you all again for coming out today and for having me here. It's a great honor to be a part of this ceremony.
It is my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Wayne Clough to Gordon State College. Many of you know Dr. Clough as President Emeritus of Georgia Tech, where he served with distinction from 1994 until 2008, when he left to head up the Smithsonian Institute. He holds a unique distinction as being the first Georgia Tech alumnus to return to serve as its president. He received his bachelor and master's degree in civil engineering at Tech before going on to complete a doctorate degree in engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. His honors and accomplishments are many, but one thing that impressed me about Dr. Clough during his time at the Smithsonian, the place we call the nation's attic, was that he set a priority that the institution's vast collection be accessible and available to everyone. It is only fitting that we now open the exhibit entitled Power to the People in this small central Georgia community by hearing from a man with such a vision for our shared history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wayne Clough.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Nooks. Mr. President, Mr. Mayor, my good friend Senator George Hooks, and distinguished guests, friends who are here, it's a great pleasure to be with you here on this special day, which is actually a double celebration. But I do want to say, Mr. President, to all of you and your staff, the folks of your staff, that your campus is a beautiful campus. It's really, I'm a student of college campuses, and it's a beautiful campus. So today, as I mentioned, it's a double celebration. Not only are we saluting the permanent installation of the Power to the People exhibition here at Gordon State College, but we're also doing it on the 80th anniversary of the speech that we just heard by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at Summers Field, right across from here, on August the 11th in 1938, which launched the operation of what was then Lamar Electric Cooperative, today Southern Rivers Energy. As Roosevelt noted in his speech on that day, the germ of the idea for what would eventually become the Rural Electrification Administration dated back to his first visit in Georgia, and as President Roosevelt said today, he recognized immediately the difference in the cost of electrical prices here in Georgia and in New York State. And my good friend Dan White, who is here, did me a favor recently when I had the privilege to speak to the Warm Springs Foundation and took me to the top of Pine Mountain and visit the spot that Franklin Roosevelt enjoyed to visit for peace and relaxation, looking out over the valley. The story that goes there is, it was my wife and I were there with Dan, and he told it. The president was there once at sunset, and he noticed no lights were coming on. And he turned to his driver, and he said, "When are the lights going to come on?" And his driver said, "Mr. President, they don't come on because there is no electricity." Such experiences here in central Georgia marked the start of a very powerful story. They started Roosevelt thinking and asking questions. He concluded electrical power was a great divider between urban and rural America. While 90% of those living in cities and towns had electricity in their home, by 1930, only 10% of the rural areas did. So bringing electricity to rural areas became a part of his first campaign for president in 1932. The very next year, his first year in office, he began to tackle that issue with the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Then in 1935, as you heard, he founded the Rural Electrification Administration by executive order. Congress subsequently passed the Rural Electrification Act in 1936, authorizing the low-cost loans that were the bedrock of the program. Within the first 5 years of the REA, newly created electric membership cooperatives constructed more rural electric lines than private power companies had built in the prior 50 years. As a result, the number of rural homes across the nation that had electricity doubled. Here in Georgia, 75% of the population of the state was living in rural areas at that time, and they were not to be deterred in their hopes for electrical power in their homes. By the time those first 5 years were over, Georgia had 33 electric membership cooperatives, including the Lamar Electric Cooperative, with Roosevelt personally coming to Barnesville to flip the switch. I know something about this story from personal experience. I was born in 1941. Now, I don't look quite that old, I know, but I was born in Douglas, Georgia, in Coffee County, south of here. My mother and father grew up in large farming families in nearby Jeff Davis County. And while they left their farm to create a small and successful business in Douglas, Georgia, most of my relatives, including my grandparents, still lived on farms. My recollection is that none of those farms, none of them, had electricity when I was a boy. Water came from wells, food was cooked over a wood-burning stove, and toilets were in outhouses. I remember well my grandfather reading stories to me by the light of a kerosene lamp. While families were close in those days, that life was also hard. And for all of you young people in the audience, I don't mean just being deprived of the internet. Wood had to be cut every day. Clothes were washed by hand. Families huddled around wood fires in the winter, and they sweltered in the summer. Then came the Satilla EMC, and I witnessed the dramatic improvements it brought to the lives of my relatives. The changes it enabled were instrumental in reducing disease, which was a big problem, in water and the outside toilets, and provided clean water and central heat to their homes. By 1953, more than 90% of the rural households of the United States had electricity, by 1953. Today, 41 EMCs blanket the state of Georgia, continuing to provide electrical services to citizens and businesses. And they are among leaders in the use of alternative clean energy through the Green Power EMC. About a year ago, I visited Jeff Davis County, where my parents grew up without electricity, to see a big solar array. I'm a big fan of solar power. It was the second stage of a large EMC-based solar project, funded privately, that is not only providing clean energy using South Georgia's own abundant sunshine, but is doing it cheaply and without using any of our precious water. Also, all the while, it's generating tax revenues for Jeff Davis County and that community that they desperately need. Now, President Roosevelt touted his Rural Electrification Administration as one of the most promising vehicles for attaining a stronger, a happier, and more prosperous America. Studies by Carl Kitchens, a professor at the University of Mississippi, show that by the introduction of the RE&A, it led to productivity improvements on America's farm, which not only boosted income, but increased property values. It was an important component in rural America's ability to pull itself out of the Great Depression. Of course, rural electrification came at a cost in the form of those long-term loans that you heard about, and critics claimed it was a boondoggle for the American taxpayer. But Professor Kitchens points out that the RA worked together with the EMCs to design the loans carefully, maximizing the chance for success and minimizing the chance for default. As a result, nearly all the loans were repaid, and the loans still on the books by 1960, less than 1% were more than 30 days delinquent. So all in all, the REA turned out to be an incredibly beneficial investment in our nation's infrastructure, achieved at very little cost to the American taxpayer. It provided an opportunity for rural America to work together to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, representing America at its best. But, as Franklin Roosevelt pointed out in his speech 80 years ago, it would take much more than simply providing electricity to Americans to bring us out of the Great Depression. He in fact listed 15 things that needed work, from land use to labor, from education to housing. As I thought about Franklin Delano Roosevelt in preparation for being with you today, I remember the many points along the way where his various programs and projects touched my own life. Seeing my relatives get electricity in their homes with the creation of the Satilla EMC was only the beginning. When I was a teenager, my family moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee to go in a new business area, an area where the TVA not only provided power, but critical flood control that enabled Chattanooga and many other cities along the river to avoid flooding. When I first came to Georgia Tech as a student, I only had to look across North Avenue and see Techwood Home, the nation's first federally subsidized housing project, which was designed by 2 Georgia Tech alumni. Roosevelt came to Georgia Tech's Grant Field to speak to 50,000 people at the dedication ceremony, just as he came to Summersfield, which was then part of Gordon Military College exactly 80 years ago today. As a Georgia Tech student, I lived in Harrison Dorm as a freshman. I studied in the old civil engineering building, 2 of 7 buildings on the Georgia Tech campus that were built with the help of the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. During my tenure as president of Georgia Tech, it was my pleasure to renovate both of these buildings, and they're still in operation at Georgia Tech. After 14 years as president of Georgia Tech, I went to Washington to become secretary of the Smithsonian. And I was impressed by the extensive collection of FDR memorabilia in its collections, his glasses, his microphone he used for his fireside chat. During our years in Washington, my wife and I lived not far from the National Mall, and we enjoyed on the evenings walking through and around the tidal basin, which takes you right through the Roosevelt Memorial. Unlike other monuments to our presidents, which are lofty and imposing, the FDR Memorial is wonderfully human and approachable in its scale. Like the man it remembers, it is engaging, uplifting, endearing, and in tune with its surroundings. The sense of peace and well-being, I always felt it as a memorial, reminded me of the words from the speech Roosevelt was scheduled to deliver on April 13th, 1945, the day after he died. He planned to say, if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all people of all kinds to live together, to work together in the same world at peace. Of course, Roosevelt was looking forward to the end of World War II, but I believe his words encompass a much broader scope. He clearly was concerned about the well-being of America and her people in the broadest sense. As president, he was confronted by a wide range of challenges, some of which we can't imagine today, including the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, providing banking stability, advocating against isolationism before World War II, and leading our country to victory in the Great War. He faced up to those challenges with new ideas, like the EMCs, that were not only imaginative and inventive, but also workable and practical, as is evidenced by those 41 EMCs that still thrive and serve their members today. Roosevelt envisioned and worked for a nation where optimism replaced fear. Freedom was secured by economic security, and competition was balanced by a kind of public-private partnership that the electrical membership cooperatives represent. That approach of cooperation and collaboration can still provide the way forward for rural Georgia today. Even as I speak, the Georgia Humanities Program is partnering with the Smithsonian to bring a Museum on Main Street exhibition to Georgia to tour 6 rural communities in the next year, a couple of years, called Crossroads, Change in Rural America. It will explore the past, present, and future of rural Georgia. The goal is to understand how rural Georgia has changed through the years and to provide an opportunity for Georgia communities to envision and explore paths they could take as they work together for a shared, better future. This past May, I was privileged to give the commencement address at South Georgia State College in Douglas, Georgia, my home. Seeing those young people graduating with their proud families watching renewed my hope for my home. I focused my comments on the lives of 3 Coffee County natives, 2 of whom have lived all their lives in Douglas, Georgia. Frankie Snow, a great friend of mine, and Francis Lott, a great Georgia Tech alum, and one who left to make a career, Keisha Tanner, who's a vice president now for BP Oil. What links them together today is their love of South Georgia. And what links them together today is that they all give back to the communities where they live because they love those communities and they want them to be successful. We want to do that ourselves. People can and do make a difference. Exactly 80 years ago today, Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke on this campus to another group of South Georgians and expressed his hopes for the future. And today we celebrate the remarkable success story that resulted from his determination to bring electricity to rural Georgia and rural America, as presented in the exhibition, Power to the People. My congratulations, President, to Gordon State College on providing a home for this exhibition so future generations can understand this great story of how local communities joined together with enlightened help from our government to change the lives of generations for the better. That is what democracy is all about. And that is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood so well. He died in April 12, 1945, in his 4th term as our president. He did not live to see the end of World War II, but he dedicated his life in service to his country. Today, we celebrate one of his accomplishments, the electrification of rural America. For we who have benefited from his legacy, it is incumbent for us to think about the debt we owe and how we can pay it forward to those that follow us. One reason Franklin Roosevelt loved this part of Georgia and spent time here was because of its beauty. Last fall, I took a kayak trip down the Satilla River with the Satilla River Riverkeeper, and it reminded me once again of how beautiful and fragile our natural heritage is here in South Georgia. I was grateful for the work and the members and volunteers of the Satilla Riverkeeper for helping us conserve a waterway of great beauty that is a resource for all those who love the outdoors. The EMCs are also helping us conserve that natural beauty as they lead the way in implementing clean, inexpensive alternative energy for the people of Georgia. They are writing a new chapter in their remarkable story, a story of how one generation can pay it forward for the next generation. I'm sure if FDR were here today, he would say how proud he was of the Georgia EMCs and the leadership they continue to provide. Thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you. Thank you.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Clough, for coming and sharing with us and just helping us to understand the context of today. We appreciate your presence here. Before I introduce our next speaker, as Dr. Clough mentioned, it takes a group of talented individuals to make something like this possible. Once again, I'd like to thank the steering committee for all of your hard work throughout the past several months. I'd like to thank, of course, especially our advancement team and Rhonda Toon. I'm not sure if she's here or if she's ran out somewhere, but there's Rhonda Toon. Rhonda, just stand up, Rhonda. The rest of the advancement team, I see you all outside. Come on in, come on in, come on in. Okay. Thank you all for all of your hard work and dedication. They've been going day in and day out, gangbusters. I've been getting emails, I've been getting calls, I've been getting texts, and all of this is because of your hard work today, so thank you. At the end of the program today, there will be a shuttle from the parking lot outside to the exhibit space in Gillebo Hall, and it will run back and forth between the exhibit and this parking lot. There is limited parking available next door to Gillebo at the Women's Clubhouse on Stafford Avenue. Our dining hall is open, and we hope that many of you will join us for lunch. So we will have golf carts available for transport, and those of you who may have difficulty walking here and to the dining hall. At this time, I would now like to ask Abit Massey of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Warm Springs Memorial Advisory Committee to come forward.
Thank you, Dr. Nooks, and what a marvelous day. It's been an honor and a privilege to be with the speakers on the platform and to hear them. I appreciate Bill Vernon inviting me. It's been so well said, I should just say amen. But for the Franklin D. Roosevelt Warm Springs Memorial Advisory Committee, which works with the Little White House and Department of Natural Resources. Let me thank you all for coming and thank the steering committee and Gordon State College for doing such a great job. Two other members of the committee are here, and I'd like to introduce them. Rhonda Rich at the front, who is an author and a columnist and an active member of the committee. And Dan White, who is the one who created, among other things, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Scholarship here at Gordon State College. And as you all know, and as has been said, Franklin Delano Roosevelt loved Georgia, and Georgia and Georgians loved Franklin Roosevelt before and while he was president. On the day he made this historic speech at Barnesville, he talked earlier at the University of Georgia in Sanford Stadium and received an honorary degree and said he was proud to be a UGA alumnus. In 1935, he dedicated the first public housing project in the country, Techwood, and then spoke to a tremendous crowd at Grant Field at Georgia Tech. In 1936 and 1938, he visited Gainesville, Georgia, immediately after the tornado, and then returned again to dedicate what is now known as Roosevelt Square, and of course made many trips to Warm Springs. I want to invite you to come next April 12th and any April 12th when you can to the ceremony at the Little White House on the anniversary of the death of President Franklin Roosevelt. Dr. Clough did, as he did today, made an outstanding speech there a couple of years ago. Haven's mother was the speaker just a few years ago. It's always a special day at the Little White House. And while you're there, if you haven't been, or if you have been, visit again the site that Dr. Clough mentioned on Pine Mountain at Dowdle's Knob. Dan White was the inspiration for the life-size statue of Franklin Roosevelt there. Secret Service would take the seat out of his car and place it there, and he would sit and look at that beautiful vista. made many of the historic decisions about the Depression and World War II, things that helped save the country and save the world. It's an exciting place to visit. Individuals and families come and have a picture made at that site with President Roosevelt. It was financed by 15 miniature statues. Appropriately, Dan White was allowed to purchase number 1, which he donated to the library at Gordon State College. One of them was purchased by Paul Wood when he was with Georgia EMC, and it was placed here in Barnesville at the Lamar EMC, now Southern Rivers Energy. So 2 of the 15 are now in Barnesville and Lamar County. So in addition to many other things, you can be proud of that. Thank you again for coming today, and what you have heard today from these fine speakers, and remembering the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, which will continue through the years. It should be a continuing inspiration to all of us to improve our service to communities and to others, and to utilize our talents as they did so well. And it's my privilege to present the man who will give our benediction, Dr. Bob Patterson, who's pastor of the First Baptist Church in Warm Springs, and who has delivered the invocation and benediction at that little White House ceremony for more than 25 years.
Could we bow our heads, close our eyes, and pray? Father God, we thank you for the ability to look back, and that while rural America lived in darkness, your servant Franklin Roosevelt employed the virtues you gave him of compassion and intelligence and action to dream a dream. And the farmers who formed the first generations of EMCs that brought the dream into reality, that brought lights, refrigerators, and radios into the reality of rural America. Looking around us, Father, I confess our collective inability to remember. So I thank you for this new exhibit, lest we forget there was a time when the people and the government helped form a more perfect union. Looking ahead, Father, I pray for leaders who will see the new necessities of life in rural America, like broadband access, and will have, in the words of FDR, sound hearts, sane minds, strong hands, and that they will strive to better the lot of their fellow man. We offer this prayer to the one who first said, "Let there be light," and amen.
This concludes our program today. Once again, thank you for coming. The exhibit will be open, and do not forget to come over to Highlander Hall for some lunch. You all take care now.